I'd like to get to the main focus of our webinar today, Dr. Andrea Weeks. Dr. Weeks is a professor of botany at George Mason University and director of its Ted Bradley Herbarium. She teaches undergraduate courses in plant biology and conducts research in angiosperm systematics. Since 2014, she has led a National Science Foundation funded initiative to digitize Virginia herbaria, enabling 250,000 herbarium specimens to be discoverable through the Cernex Symbiota portal. She is a past president of the Society of Herbarium Curators, a member of the Virginia Botanical Associates, which manages the digital atlas of the Virginia flora, and is a board member of the Flora Project, of the Flora Virginia Project. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen to let Andrea share hers.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction. Let me share my screen. All right. Okay. You see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for the invitation. I'm really encouraged and excited to see the number of people in the audience. It's really great to see a crowd of people concerned about non-native plants. I am coming to you live from Loudoun County in the interest of being transparent since everyone else has shared. So the sort of informal title for my talk today is called Gaps in the Maps, the Digital Atlas of the Virginia Flora, Invasive Plants, and You. So I'm gonna be cognizant of the time since we have about 45 minutes to get through this information. So try to be really clear up front. So my outline for today is I'm going to be talking to you about the scope and the history of the digital atlas of the Virginia flora. I'll be talking about how plant records are documented and how they appear on these maps. I'll give you a few illustrative case examples about why this type of work is interesting and important. And I'll also be including a number of links to helpful resources. I think some of them are going to be added live to the chat. There's also going to be a PDF. I've already given it to Rowena that lists all the URLs that I mentioned in case, so you don't have to be madly taking notes. On this slide are some screenshots that I've taken from the digital atlas, and this may be familiar to many of you. Uh, my ultimate agenda is that everyone in the audience today will leave knowing how to help fill plant record gaps in these atlas maps for both native plants and also naturally occurring non-native plants. And then ultimately sort of be able to share a little bit more about why this type of work matters. Right, I was just checking the chat to make sure no one was immediately asking me questions. Okay, what is the scope of the atlas? This resource provides county level maps for over 4,400 vascular plant species as well as bryophyte species. Virginia has 95 counties. We map in the Atlas Project both native plant species as well as naturally occurring non-native plant species. And I'll describe a little bit about what that means in a few slides. Now, the thing that really distinguishes the Atlas from projects like iNaturalist, which is an incredibly important project, is that every occurrence dot that appears on these maps is tied to a physical, verified herbarium specimen of that plant from that location. And this herbarium specimen is deposited in a herbarium. Mostly they're stored in Virginia, but we have a large number that are actually stored in herbaria out of state that we know about because people from outside the state come to collect in Virginia as well, and they bring their specimens back. All this information is publicly available at this website. This again is a screenshot from the homepage of the Digital Atlas Project. It's a simple website. You can search by scientific or common name. We have a whole list of synonyms, so if you're not necessarily using the most up-to-date name, it'll still get you to where you need to go. You can browse by family or genus, or if you know the species in particular. Because these are county level maps, we maintain county level lists of everything that has been verified and documented with a herbarium specimen for every single state or every single county in the state. So you can search by county to look at your county level list. There's also some information about the backstory of this project. And then there's also a very useful tab, which I'll expand on in my talk, about how to contribute new records to this effort. And again, the scope is vascular plants, so things, ferns, conifers, flowering plants, um, uh, lycophytes, as well as a growing atlas representation for mosses and other bryophytes. If you search for a record on the atlas, you are going to access the three types of information. And again, it's a simple website. It's just the facts. We have a county level map for a particular species. In this case, I'm giving you the example of Corygulis incisa, which is an introduced plant that is naturally occurring. It is not a native plant. It will list its family name, its common names. Um, There will also be typically two sections that are often very interesting to read. One is a comment section that will tell you a little bit, perhaps, and will cite a scientific paper that talks about the appearance of this species, perhaps its impact that has been experimentally documented. And then a more elaborate descriptor of the type of habitat that this species has been collected in. So in the case of Corygulis incisa, uh, the comment section includes the citation to the paper where it is first reported in the flora in the United States, and then some observations about where this plant has been found elsewhere in the United States, and then some well-informed perspective from these herbarium specimens, which is we see that it is well established in several areas of the Potomac and James River drainages, and experience suggests the species is almost certainly occurring undetected at additional sites. This species really only came onto the radar of the atlas in 2014. There are also high resolution, very high quality images of the plant species, and all of these have been vetted by botanists. So we are certain that these photos truly represent the species being reported for each page. Okay, so as an example, every dot in the atlas is based on a herbarium specimen. In this, I just wanted to show you an example of what a plant record looks like. So this happens to be a county record that I found a couple years ago in Shenandoah County. This happens to be a native plant. It's Cubelium concolor, which is also known as the green violet. I was very tickled to find it and realize that it was a county record. Um, on the left-hand side, you can see an image of the herbarium specimen. You can see dried, pressed pieces of the plant. There is a herbarium label down in the lower right-hand corner. In the middle here is the atlas map. That little red dot in the black circle, that is the dot that's my dot. But that dot is based on this specimen. And this specimen is stored as a natural history specimen in the herbarium at my university. It could be anywhere in a herbarium, but because I collected it, I deposited it at my university's herbarium. And this is the folder in which it resides. And this is actually the cabinet where it resides with all the other violets. This is just to emphasize that every single dot in the atlas is based on a physical specimen, which means when you do the math and you realize how many dots we have, is that there are hundreds of thousands of herbarium specimens in existence today being stored at natural history collections that underlie the atlas. And these specimens are stored in perpetuity as natural history research specimens for any future resource use. They're findable, they're typically in a database. You can ask to see them because they are a scientific reference collection. So they are meant to be seen by people and used in the future. A little bit of backstory about the history. This project is over 50 years old. We're now on really to like the full second generation of botanists in this state managing this project. The first atlases were published in paper, and the first versions of the atlas for the state were published in the late 1970s. And these dot maps have been continually updated since then. Initially, it was paper and pen, but in 2005, this project was converted into a database and it made its debut as in only a digital form. Now, you can order hard paper or hard copies of the atlas if you really want to have one, but for the most part, nearly all, actually always interact with the atlas digitally online. Since 2012, the Atlas Project, which is a longstanding group, developed a memorandum of understanding with the Flora Virginia Project to share data. So the distributional information that is presented in the Flora Virginia comes from the Atlas Project. And since 2020, when the Flora Virginia Project created a smartphone app to share the flora, uh, the Atlas project is now also providing the little thumbnail maps and also many high resolution images of these plant species that you can access now from the Flora of Virginia. So I just want to distinguish the Atlas project is different than the Flora of Virginia project, but they have many of the same goals. Just to illustrate this, this is a picture of the Flora of Virginia opened up, and it's actually open to the page for Corygulus, which is that plant species that was documented in 2014. If you look at the Flora of Virginia, the printed version, you will not see this species in this book because this book, its physical form, was published in 2012, and Corygulus incisa came on to everyone's radar in 2014. Now, the Flora of Virginia does incorporate this information still, and that is because the Flora of Virginia has a smartphone app, and that is routinely updated. So if you open up your Flora of Virginia app, you will notice that there is a detailed description of this, what is likely an invasive species. It's certainly non-native. You have a scientific description. It's included in the identification keys. There are further panels in the Flora Virginia app that you can click for a range map, and that range map that you see has been pulled in from the Atlas project when the app has been updated. So that means that the digital Atlas maps online right now are the most up-to-date ones, but as soon as the Flora Virginia app gets updated, they all get refreshed. Also in the Flora app, you can see those high resolution, very detailed images of the plant species. They're also pulled into the app, but these are coming from the Atlas project. The work of updating the app or the Atlas never stops, and it doesn't stop for two reasons. We are always learning more about the distribution of both native plants and naturally established non-native plants. This involves adding new state records. In some cases, particularly non-native species, they are suddenly in our state, and it's the first time that we've ever seen them. More often, though, we're adding county records for non-native plants, but also for native plants, which often comes as a surprise to people. Uh, Western European science has been botanizing Virginia for over 400 years, so it comes as a surprise that this type of information is still new. We are still discovering things about the flora of Virginia. The other reason why the Atlas has to continually update its information is that we need to keep pace with the required name changes, the nomenclatural changes that reflect new taxonomic information that comes out. And the Atlas crew spends a while evaluating whether or not we are incorporating those nomenclatural changes. This includes things like splitting one species into two recognized varieties, so we have to regenerate maps, or maybe the molecular information come down that show us that these varieties are actually not distinct, in which we have to lump them back together again and remake the map. And again, this work has been going on for over 50 years. Little wrinkle, and I think it's a finer point, but it's worth emphasizing. This is an example of an atlas entry for a native plant. This is swamp white oak, which is a very well-known oak species. It's a well-known native. And I circle Warren County, and you will notice that there is no red dot in Warren County. And this is just to remind you that science is doing the best it can, but um, swamp white oak truly may grow in Warren County, but we haven't seen a voucher for it, and so it's not mapped. And this is where the value of eyes on the ground really is important for advancing this type of work. An unintended consequence of this can be that people look at the atlas maps and landscape planners may decide not to recommend a native like this for planting in Warren County because it is not listed as native. It's not, there's not a dot for it. That's not an intended consequence for the atlas. It is the most up-to-date information that we have with the caveat that we may discover more in the future. Who does this work? New state and county occurrences are reported to the atlas by anyone and can be included as long as there is a herbarium voucher to prove it. And the point of my talking to all of you today is to emphasize that anyone can be you. And I hope it can be you. Um, Ultimately, these vouchers get reported, and the members of the Virginia Botanical Associates, this is a nonprofit group. It's run, organized by a group of volunteer professional botanists and curators who live and work in Virginia. They manage the maps, so they manage that digital resource and are talking to herbarium curators and looking at the records, which are typically now digitized, and saying, "Yep, that is absolutely county record. We're putting the dot on the map." At this point, I haven't talked about invasive plants. I've just been using this phrase non-native plants. So I just want to spend a little bit time talking about this. Non-native plants are a particular challenge to map for the atlas for many of the reasons that everyone already knows, particularly in the PRISM group. And that is the fact that new non-native plant species become naturally established in Virginia continually. It does not stop. They do not respect state and county boundaries. They go where they want. They can also spread very rapidly depending on the biology of the species. And there are just not enough people who are collecting these plants, making the vouchers to keep up in terms of monitoring in this way, the way the atlas runs. Anecdotally, and we know this from our experiencing receiving records and what we understand is on the ground, is that people are just less likely to voucher and report non-natives than they are native plants because it is an expenditure of time. You have to make a physical specimen, you have to get it to somewhere. And that is often not, it's just not part of sort of um, the calculation that people make in terms of how they want to spend their time, but it is incredibly valuable to be documenting these non-natives. I want to say and be a big proponent for using iNaturalist. It is an amazing monitoring tool. I use it all the time. I know lots of field botanists do as well to see, oh, who's seeing stuff? Could we possibly get a county record out of that? And but I will just say, from the perspective of the atlas, and for many scientists, iNaturalist is not enough. A digital record is good, but it is not the full solution for advancing floristic research and scientific research long term. iNaturalist is a really great data set, but it's not the complete one. So now I'm going to try to convince you why. All right. I also just want to point out that the atlas doesn't make decisions about what is invasive and not invasive. It is just not native. And I think, so I give you an example here. A naturally occurring non-native plant may or may not become invasive. Invasive is in sort of this ecological category where we know that it really negatively impacts the environment in many different ways. that are that we know are possible. Here are two members of the same family, about the same size. Um, One on the left-hand side, money plant, Lunaria annua. It's mapped. It's a non-native. It is introduced. It's not invasive. It actually doesn't really persist very long on the landscape. Whereas another member of its family, a notorious member, garlic mustard, introduced and it is invasive. And we know it has allelopathic impacts, and many ecological studies have demonstrated how impactful this species can be in Virginia's environment. So, and this is one of the reasons why we want to document. We don't know who's going to become a problem. Physical vouchers are needed for proof for two main reasons. iNaturalist works on, particularly the AI function of iNaturalist, works on the quality of your specimens. But there are many cases, very small characters that cannot and typically are not photographed, very small ones that can make the difference between diagnosing it as one species versus another. So things like on length on the florets of grasses, or the sculpturing of the achene fruits in sedges, for instance. You got to put them under a scope to really be sure that the species is what you think it is. Um, so for 100% diagnostic capability, we want to see the physical proof. It also makes it, from a scientific perspective, like replicable, like someone can go verify it. The physical specimens ultimately then create this long-term repository of information that captures the morphological and genetic diversity of our state's flora, as well as species ecological habitats and abundances on the landscapes that ultimately will support future discovery. We don't know how those specimens are going to be used in the future, but we know that they are valuable. And so I'm going to give you three recently published examples from the scientific literature. They're all open access papers and they are free to read, and you don't have to buy the PDFs, about why physical vouchers are important. This is a good one. An invasive that has been hiding in plain sight for decades. So Persicaria pasumbo, which is known as Asian lady's thumb, was reported in the United States in a paper in 2020. And it is very similar morphologically to a well-known invasive, Persicaria longicida. This paper published a new identification key that helps you distinguish between these two species. And when we use that new key on old herbarium specimens, we figured out that in Virginia, we have had this species in Virginia since 1968. So herbarium specimens were made in 1968 of so-called longicida. They were misidentified. So this species has been flying under the radar for decades. The atlas has the backstory on this if you're interested in learning more. Another paper that came out within the last few years is a paper published by a group of authors. It was published in the American Journal of Botany about Japanese stilt grass, which is a very well-known invasive. We're all familiar with it. But there's some very interesting morphological variation that bears some watching. So this is a retrospective study that was looking at stilt grass specimens that were collected, the earliest records in the United States from the 1930s, and charting how there are actually two different versions of Japanese stilt grass on the landscape that you may not recognize and that are worthy of distinguishing from one another. And this would have been impossible to do if we just had sort of low resolution images of the species in the field, as are often the case on iNaturalist. A paper came out a couple years ago that blew my mind. I highly recommend this paper. This is a type of paper that would have been impossible to write 10 years ago. And this is leveraging hundreds of thousands of herbarium records that have been digitized. So these are herbarium specimens, and all that data has become machine readable now, and to do a very high level analysis about the long-term fate of plant invasions on the landscape. In this case, they were focused on the Northeast United States, But looking at through time from records from like 1860 and 1880 and 1930 and 1960, figuring out what non-native species have come in and how long they have persisted on the landscape. And so they distinguish between, species that seem to really just sort of come and go as waifs. Others tend to stick around for some period of time but disappear. Others become well established, but they don't seem to leave the Northeast for some reason, and others that just run rampant across the country. And so that type of comparative analysis is really exciting because we can start to generate hypotheses about, like, well, why? Why are there these differences? Why do some plants become wildly invasive and others don't? Okay, so I want everybody to leave knowing how to document county records. So I'm going to walk you through a hypothetical situation. Let's say that you are walking along a tributary of Goose Creek in Loudoun County, and you spot this pretty purple flowered thing, and you're like, oh, that's Corylus incisa. Um, that shouldn't be here. It's a non-native. And the first thing you want to do is figure out if it's actually naturally occurring or not. So this is a quotation from the atlas. Non-native species are just as important to document as native ones, but only naturally occurring non-natives are mapped. To be considered as a new record, a species would need to have become established where it is currently located via unassisted reproduction and spread rather than being planted or seeded. So, yeah, there are wildflower meadows that get seeded and you know they did. That's not an example of something that is naturally occurring. It's been planted. Um, these factors can be difficult to assess, and the best time to do that is when you're there in the field. If you even but even if you question it, you can write that information on the label. You can say, I think this area may have been planted in a wildflower meadow 5 years ago. I'm not sure. So I think it's naturally occurring. I'm not quite sure. Even that level of information is important because it could be that in 10 years this thing becomes invasive. And we can go back to that specimen and be like, you know what? It was flagged. We think it came in there. Once you've established that it's naturally occurring, you need to check the atlas to verify that you indeed have a discovery that is a true county record. So I would check the dot map, and then I would also check the textual list for the county. So in this case, I would look up Loudoun County, and I would run my finger down the list and see if Cordulus incisa is there on the list. And if it's not, then you have yourself a county record. All of these directions, I'll just state again, are on the Atlas website. But I want to give a little bit more information since this can be a barrier. You have to make a physical voucher of what you found. And so we call these herbarium specimens or herbarium vouchers. They pretty much all look the same. Herbarium sheets are generally 11 and a half by 16 and a half large. That's how big the sheet of paper is. And so that's essentially your working area for where you have to fit your plant into. Um, and you generally have to sort of accordion it and sort of carefully place it so that all of the relevant information is visible. This usually means the specimen should be reproductive. The specimen should be sufficient to confidently be identified, which normally means having flowers and or fruits. Taxonomically important or diagnostic characters will vary from group to group and usually includes roots, but this may at times be impractical or a conservation concern. So I want to expand that a little bit. What are diagnostic characters? How do you know? Great way to do that is to open up your Flora Virginia app and look at the dichotomous key and see what they're really calling out. Maybe it's hairs on the sepals, in which case you really want to make sure you include some sepals as part of that reproductive material. Um, then this business about roots gets into the ethics of destructive collecting. There's a lot to say about this, way more than I can cover in this talk. If we're dealing with invasive plants, we probably don't mind if we destroy that plant, if we're removing it from the environment. But if you're dealing with a particularly like a perennial plant and you rip up all of its roots, like a herbaceous perennial, you remove that plant, that individual from the environment. It's not, for me personally, it's not much of a concern for non-native and invasive plants. For native plants, I pause and I ask myself, um, am I going to harm the population by removing this individual? There's sort of this thing called the 1 in 50 rule. Doesn't really have a precise definition, but it's basically use your best judgment. If you are going to completely remove the species from the environment by destroying the plant, you shouldn't do it. Um, if it is a very common plant, including the roots is really important because sometimes the characters right at the base of the plant, like a basal rosette right on top of stems, like with a Dicanthelium species, is essential for species identification. And roots have their own very interesting biology that are worth preserving on herbarium sheets, but not to the expense of the life of a native plant if you're going to remove it from the population. Um, for orchids, if it's not a particularly rare orchid, I usually don't dig it up. I might just trim a flowering stem. Again, that removes reproductive effort for the year, but again, use your best judgment. For woody plants, sampling generally doesn't harm them at all. You're generally taking a branch that is maybe the length of your forearm, and for a large woody plant, that has virtually no impact on the health of that individual. This is a image from a blog post that I found, which I thought was a really interesting blog post about um, being a field biology, but also being very savvy about making herbarium specimens. And so I've included that as a URL in one of the resource links. Um, Okay, let me go back. I will not show this video, but I include it because I think making herbarium specimens are best learned at the elbow of somebody actually doing the work. But this is a 6-minute instructional video that this man in the red striped shirt will basically walk you through placing this cut branch into a plant press. All it is you put the plant material between two sheets of newspaper, which act as a blotter. Then you sandwich it between layers of cardboard, and then you place either a heavy weight on top to squash it, or you actually bind it into an official plant press. You don't need an official plant press. The official plant press is just a more efficient way of making your specimens, but it's not essential. You just need it flattened and dried with good airflow so it doesn't mold. Once a plant is dried, you don't have to do anything to it. As long as it stays dry, it can stay useful for centuries if it is prepared archivally and stored carefully. The collection label is just as important as the physical specimen of the plant. I show you an example of a label that I would make. This is a high bar to reach, so I do not include this to like intimidate you. I just want to show you a really close example of like the best possible label and to bring it down a little bit and just talk about the very important pieces of information in addition to your species identification. And that is the location. You should write out where you found it, and the information should be good enough so that anyone can go find that plant again or go to that exact location. So, county, city, where are you along the highway? How far in from the road are you? A GPS coordinate. If you use INAT, all of your INAT observations get tied to a lat long that is developed by your iPhone, and that is good enough. Um, so location, that is really, really important. Date, that is extraordinarily important. So the month, the date, and the year. And then ideally your name, so we know who did that work. And if you have a collection number, that's great. You don't need to have a collection number, but we like to know the author of the specimen, the date, and the location. And of course, there's going to be a species identification. Now, if you want to get even more detailed, you can expand your observations that you're writing down. Um, aspects of the plant that might not preserve well, like how tall is the tree? What color are the flowers? These things don't record well over time. They don't fit on the herbarium specimen, or they may fade over time. If you know more about the flora, you can write down what's growing next to it, but it's not necessary. The most three most important bits of information are detailed location, date, and your name. Everything else is icing on the cake. And this information has to be associated with your pressed specimen. You can write it down on a 3x5 card. If you want to get fancy, you can type it up. But this depends on where you're sending the specimen to. Because if you have a relationship with a local herbarium, you write them and you say, I have a county record. How would you like me to get you this information? They may just say something like, well, write down all the information and we'll make a pretty label for it in our database. So don't let that barrier stop you from reporting that information. And again, this wonderful um, expansion of this label also I found on a great blog post, and it walks you through exactly what these little bits and pieces are for. But again, this is a really high level quality label. And you'll see it has a barcode on the bottom. That is something that would have been generated by the herbarium because they barcode their specimens when they put them into the digitized database. This last point is an essential one, is that you have to deposit your specimen somewhere. And this involves putting something in the mail. Contact your local herbarium about your probable county record. And when you get a hold of them, and if they agree, they usually do, you will ship the physical specimen to them along with the label. And the curator will verify what you found and they will report it to the atlas. Now, I want to be a little bit more specific about this. There are several large herbaria in the state that are actively curated, that I know routinely accessions county records. And they may accept gifts of vouchers because that is what it is. This is a gift. You're permanently giving this specimen to the herbarium as a research specimen. They are George Mason University, Virginia Tech, University of Richmond, Old Dominion University, and College of William and Mary. I know they are actively accessioning county records. There may be more. And generally, these things are very easy to ship as long as you get them rigid. You put them in a big mailer that's not bendable, and they're good to go. They're very easy to ship. How do you get in contact with Herbaria? Instead of giving you a laundry list of emails, what I'm going to do is I'm giving you the address of what are essentially the white pages for herbaria around the world. It's called Index Herbariorum. If you Google Index Herbariorum, it will get you to these white pages. I guess I'm dating myself by using the term white pages. It is a directory and it is run by the New York Botanical Garden. And you can search by state. So you can enter Virginia into the search and you can get a listing of all the herbaria in the state. I recommend contacting one closest to you. And the small list that I just referenced pretty much hits all the corners of the state. So I'm up in Northern Virginia, William and Mary down in the southeast corner, Tech is all the way out to the west, and there are places in the middle as well. Email, and the contact is via email. And so uh, reach out and tell them what you have. And it's a great way to establish a relationship and learn a little bit more. I want to end on I hope an empowering message, and that is your knowledge is invaluable. You know a lot about the flora already. You are often in the best position to notice when something new arrives where you live or where you work or what have you. Uh, I encourage all of you, wherever you are in the county, to find your county list and run your finger down the list because you may immediately see things that you know of that are not vouchered and that you could get some county records. You can sort of gamify the system. You can be like, oh, they don't have swamp white oak. I bet I could find one if I go look here. This is how the atlas was built. Um, a fun fact I've learned recently that something like 83% of Virginia is privately owned. So we have to depend on the people who own that land to report on what they have. Some suggestions for upskilling may or may not be useful to all of you. Learn to use iNaturalist. Again, these are great monitoring for seeing something and saying something, particularly when we're dealing with non-natives. Maybe it's a record, maybe it's not. Learn to use the Flora Virginia smartphone app for identifying, being able to distinguish a native from a non-native. Sometimes it's a subtle difference. The Flora Virginia project has a number of learning resources available. And then I would also really encourage you to reach out to your local herbarium that might be accessioning records, just saying, hey, I think I have some. I'm going to send them your way. I watched this seminar and, I'm eager to help. And I suspect that you will get a response, an eager response. Just as an example of one of these resources, the Flora Virginia has what we are now calling the Ambassador Program. So for the last few years, we've been training a group of skilled volunteers in using the Flora Virginia identification app. And that is to essentially train the trainers. So we now have 35 ambassadors to date who are leading programs and representing the flora at events for training people to how to use the app to identify natives and also to identify non-natives. That obviously is particularly helpful when you want to have an invasive poll. These are just a list of the resource links. And again, I have put them all together in a PDF and I've already shared it to Rowena, who has told me she will distribute it at the end of the seminar. So in case you haven't jotted down those URLs, they are here, as well as a few others. If you're really excited, you want to buy a plant press, one of those really nice oak ones, there are different places you can get them. I typically go to a place called herbariumsupply.com to get my presses. They sell them elsewhere. If you want to look at more images of herbarium specimens, so again, many of these herbarium specimens have been digitized, high resolution images taken. All of their label data is findable in a database. The sort of one-stop shop in the United States is idigbio.org. It's a initiative that's funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation for making all of these data in the U.S. natural history collections publicly accessible by anyone, and it's meant to promote research. So with that, I think I'm ending on time. I have 10 minutes left, and I'm welcome questions.
Okay. Thanks so much, Andrea. That was really interesting. Um, and I know that a lot of people are now inspired to go ahead and do this. If you want to stop sharing your
Okay.
screen, I'll share mine. And let's see. Great. So now we're in the question and answers session. We don't have much time. We only have around 10 minutes. If you've got any questions you'd like us to ask Andrea relating to this presentation, please go ahead and type it in the Q&A and we'll relay that live. But we've gotten a few questions about what to do about like if you see a specimen and do you have to get permission from a landowner to take like an invasive species specimen from their land? I know the answer to that, but I figure you could say it out loud.
Sure. Collecting of any sort, whether it's on federal, state, or county land, like you have to get permission to collect anything, whether native or non-native. If it's on somebody's private land, yeah, you have to get landowner permission. If it's on the edges of the road, there's a reasonable limit that you can walk in from the edge of the road. That you're within the right of way that I'm comfortable just taking and not, knocking on someone's door. But that no, that is a wise question to ask because it can be complicated, particularly in places like parks.
Right, right. Yeah, so be careful about that. You don't want to get in trouble, but I'm glad we were able to address that. One question I'm going to ask and then go to Lauren to see if she's got any that people have asked is that is it worth to report a species that's already listed for your county? So if you already have a dot on there, is it worth it?
It can be.
Hmm.
So it wouldn't be considered a county record, but that
Hmm.
doesn't mean that making a herbarium specimen of it and depositing it in a herbarium is not worth it. And in fact, when I have students do floras of parks for their thesis project, they are collecting everything because again, we don't know how those specimens are going to be used in the future. So sure, maybe it's another specimen of Japanese stiltgrass among dozens that we already have. But perhaps this is the first time that it has been seen in the park or seen in the area. So there is value. There's scientific value for making vouchers of non-native species, even if they aren't county records. And I think using your best judgment about, why you're doing this is a really is important. There can be many reasons why it's useful.
Makes sense. Oh, actually, I do have just relating to that. If we're PRISM, so we're in the business of removing invasive plants. So someone did ask, what if an invasive is removed after documentation? Do we update the records?
No, no,
No?
nope.
Okay.
Once they get made, they are a snapshot in history. And
Got it. Okay.
as we know, you may think you haven't, you may haven't read, but you didn't go over the hill, and it is actually still there. And so having that record, that initial record, is so important for sort of putting together the forensics of how these things move across the landscape.
Thanks. I think a lot of people might have been confused by that. So I'm glad that you clarified that. Lauren, do you have any other questions from the audience?
Uh, Francis is asking if you could back up a slide and show the list of resources right before the question slide. And then um, Sarah is asking, how should you document permission on private land? Do you need to document permission on private land?
For
I'll answer the question, the thing about the slide. I'm going to be sending that out, Sarah, to everyone. So don't worry about that right now. You'll get it in an email, and it will have the all of the resources that Andrea listed in the email. And Andrea, I'll leave you to the other question.
So I think the curator, so when you have the conversation with the curator and say, I have this record, they will ask you, is this from a county park? Do you have the permits? Did you talk to someone? So there's often a verbal communication. For private landowners, you definitely want to get their permission because they may not want a GPS coordinate out there, because they have the right to privacy. So again, this is a conversation you need to have with a private landowner about like how comfortable they are with an extremely precise location on their property. Um, and so you can be a little bit more vague about where you got it. You could say, you found it in Loudoun County, along Highway 15, but you don't have to say the street address, for instance. So use your best judgment.
Okay. Do you have any more, Lauren?
Rosalind is asking, why not include photographs?
So that's a great point. Um, it's a finer point, and I didn't talk about it. Um, One thing that I often do is when I'm making physical vouchers, I'm also taking iNaturalist record. I'm making an iNaturalist record in addition to making a physical voucher. And when I put my label together, I put the URL to the iNat observation so that, and some people even put little QR codes on their labels so that you can actually backtrack and see the images of the specimen. Some people, if they want to, they do include photos. That's wonderful to have a color image of a flower of that specimen when you collected it. In really rare cases, particularly for native plants, like really rare orchids that we want to voucher, but we do not want to make a physical voucher of them, you can do a photo voucher. It is a very rare case, but if you are really like, generally people know, if you know orchids, to look and be very careful. But photo vouchers are accepted at Herbaria, and they are scientifically accepted as well, as long as those photos are very high resolution and show the diagnostic characters. But that's also a good question to sort of, when you have that conversation with your herbarium curator, like tell them about the situation.
Okay. How about like one more question? Is there any Natalie, or I see that Natalie's on here. Oh, Francis is the one who asked about the thing. Francis, don't worry, I'll send everybody the resources.
There was a question about, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, it's called adventives.
So yeah, so plants that pop up. So again, this gets to sort of what is naturally occurring and established. Um, Documenting waifs is, so we would call that an adventive. You might think of, I think the atlas would call that a waif, where it's just sort of this one-time pop-up, maybe something that pops up in a gravel yard, and you're like, oh, that is strange. I don't know what that is, and you document it. That is a valuable specimen, and the atlas actually does want to know about that because it's clearly it got there by itself, probably. I mean, it may have been imported, but getting that record and noting that on the label is really important. Um, Particularly if you've just it could potentially be a county record. Because that's often like the first thing that happens is that they come into a gravel yard and then gets spread by truck tires across the highways and wind up everywhere.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. So we've only got a couple more minutes, but I wanted to ask you one last question, Andrea. For someone like me who's never done this before, I've never taken a sample before or established it. Just really basically, what are the first few steps I should do? Like for example, let's say I obviously know there are let's say there are some invasive plants on my road. The first thing that I should do is probably just buy the materials from those websites that you showed, like, so the paper, we can get that, and from
Not
there?
even that. You can do this for free. Really all
Okay,
you need is cardboard of the appropriate size. So, an Amazon shipping box, you can sort of cut it down into those sheets. You only need a few. And newspaper. So old newspapers, and you just sort of tear them to fit that 11 and a half by, what is it,
all right,
16 and a
okay.
half sheet. And you have some newspaper bifolds, and then you maybe have some heavy books. And so really, I mean, what I do if I'm somewhere and I see a county record like that county record that I showed, I was not prepared to collect that day, but I'm like, I need that. I need to make a specimen of it. So I found like an old uh giant supermarket plastic bag, and I shoved the plant in the plastic bag. I came home and it's not wilting in the bag. And then I had all my stuff together, and I could make that specimen. So a plant in a plastic bag can last a long time until you get someplace where you can get the equipment. And it's often much nicer because you can sit down with, a glass of something and be nice and cool and comfortable as opposed to sweating and pressing in the field or on the side of the highway.
Okay, well, thank you. That makes it very relatable. Then, I'll just go out there with my little plastic bag and pull it out, and
And your
that's
phone,
fine.
but your
And my
phone is a
phone,
great
right? So
tool,
I can do
right?
the iNaturals at the
Do
same
the
time.
little iNAS, like record all the information. You can do it all born digitally and then just email yourself the text, and there you go.
Perfect. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I want to thank you again for really this fascinating delve into how all of us can be citizen scientists in collecting and sharing information about native and invasive plants. I just want to remind people, if you have any questions about the Flora of Virginia app, go ahead and put them in the Q&A right now. And if we don't get to them, or if Jenny can't get to them, I will forward those questions to her, and she can get a hold of you to answer them. But now it is 1:01, so we've got to move on really quick. We just want to give you all this information. If you want to find out more about invasive plants and what Blue Ridge Prism does in Virginia, please go to our website, blueridgeprism.org. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us at info@blueridgeprism.org. Follow us on social media, volunteer with us, same address. And again, we are really happy to provide these webinars, these brown bag webinars, free of charge to the audience, but it's not free for us to produce. So if you feel so inclined, we always welcome donations of any size. It really helps us provide educational outreach to the public in a affordable or free manner, and it really helps spread education. So thank you for considering. Just a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you in a few days. So sit tight. You get to watch this all again at your leisure. And I'll also be including that list of resources that Andrea shared on the screen with this email. So you'll have it right at hand to utilize whenever you want to. And that's it. Thank you for joining us. There's going to be a short survey that pops up after you log out of here, and it just helps us to know what different subjects are, how else we can best serve you. So if you can just takes a couple minutes to fill it out, that would be great. We're really grateful to all of you in the Virginia Environmental Endowment for helping us reach as many people with outreach and educational materials like this. So with that, we're going to end. Thanks so much for spending your lunch hour with us. Thank you to Andrea and Jenny and Lauren and Natalie for being here with us. And we hope we'll see you next time. Take care, all.